In this video, we continue our investigation of former Native American sites in the Chicago region. This time, we will be exploring the Kautz Site, along the bluffs of a knoll overlooking the west branch of the DuPage River, situated in West Chicago, Illinois, where, for thousands of years, indigenous peoples returned again and again as they roamed across the early American landscape, benefiting from the rich harvest of the surrounding forest, the quiet river, the marshy fens, and the freshwater springs. Please join us as we examine the Kautz Site.
Primary sources for this video include The Prehistoric Economics of the Kautz Site, a late archaic and woodland site in northeastern Illinois, by Peter J Geraci of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. 1958 to 1960 Field Notes from David Jonathan Wenner, field archaeologist. The article An Archaeological Survey of the DuPage River Drainage by Sanford Herrick Gates, from the December 1961 Illinois Archaeological Survey Bulletin No. 3. Period plat maps and topographical maps.
The Kautz Site is situated on private property, just to the east of the aptly named Indian Knoll Road, about where the road intersects with Hawthorne Lane in West Chicago, DuPage County, Illinois. It sits along the eastern slope of a prominent ridge or bluff that defines the west bank of the west branch of the DuPage River, which flows north and south 200 yards to the east. By happenstance, it lies almost exactly on the north edge of Winfield Township and the southern line of Wayne Township in DuPage County. The former CA&E Railroad, today the Elgin branch of the Illinois Prairie Path, passes within 500 feet to the north of the location. The site is known to archaeologists as 11DU46, the 11 referring to Illinois as part of the Smithsonian's National Numbering System, the DU referring to DuPage County, and the 46 denoting the sequential number assigned to the site upon official registration in the 1950s by local amateur archaeologist David J Wenner.
Around the year 1940, Joseph Edward Kautz and his wife, Verna Benjamin Kautz, moved onto the farmette along the west branch of the DuPage River that was to become their home for the remainder of their lives. Joseph had been an automobile mechanic by trade, having grown up in nearby Geneva in Kane County, Illinois, before he and Verna married in 1918. Verna's family, the Benjamins, were among the earliest settlers of South Wayne Township and North Winfield Township, DuPage County, having purchased their land from the U.S. government in the mid-1840s, after the forced removal of Native Americans from the area in the 1820s and 1830s. Her father, Nelson Benjamin, a farmer, had passed away in 1938, and Joseph and Verna moved to the Benjamin farm in order to take care of Verna's mother, Beatrice.
Joseph Kautz was well acquainted with the pastoral life, as his parents, Frank and Frida, had been longtime dairy farmers in Kane County. In fact, he and Verna had started out farming when they first married, but Joseph soon found that tinkering with the new technology of gasoline-powered automobiles was a more lucrative way to make a living. Verna's mother, Beatrice Benjamin, passed away in the early months of 1950, and Verna, being the only child, inherited the Benjamin family farm, locally known as the Spring Hill Farm.
Over the course of many decades, it was not unusual for the Benjamins to find the occasional pottery sherd or projectile point in their fields, or by their house and outbuildings. Sometime after the Kautzes moved in, Joseph had need to transfer a few loads of soil from near their pig pen to their yard area. It was at this time that he noticed a substantial collection of large pottery sherds, broken pieces of ceramic, within the dirt spoils. The news of his find spread among his local community, and multiple family members and friends were said to have taken home artifacts from Joseph Kautz's crude excavation.
Within a few years, in 1954, a few amateur archaeologists were investigating the area, looking for prospective habitation sites of indigenous peoples. They were attempting to more carefully survey the relatively unexplored DuPage River system for archaeological remains before urban and suburban developments could wipe away any traces of the former inhabitants. The group included David J Wenner, an avid and experienced amateur archaeologist from Oklahoma, Stanford or Sam Gates, an amateur archaeologist from Naperville, and Henry or Hank Rademacher, another local amateur archaeologist from DuPage County. They made note of the Kautz site at that time, Wenner going so far as to denote it as 11DU5 in his records, although his group did not follow through with the investigation of the site at that time.
Having more or less completed their general survey of the DuPage River system, 4 years later, in the spring of 1958, Wenner returned to the Kautz site, as it perhaps represented one of their more promising locations. He more carefully inspected their collection and obtained the Kautz's permission for a more formal excavation, noting that the collection included 2 complexes, Hopewell and Late Woodland. Very promising. Planned to test at once.
Later, in the autumn of 1958, a small group of amateur archaeologists, led by Wenner, descended upon the Kautz Farmette. Unlike today, where a few dozen large homes line Indian Knoll Road, in the mid-1950s, the area was much more open, with only a few farmettes populating the rural landscape. The location was then only lightly timbered. A few copses of trees and shrubs stood out in what were open meadows and fields leading down from the ridge to the river. Wenner recorded that he believed the site to have seen little or no plowing over the past century, as the soil was very rocky and generally undisturbed.
In October, the amateur crew surface collected the site, which they now refer to as 11DU46, before establishing a general plan for an excavation, making use of standard archaeological techniques of the 1950s. This included the establishment of a datum point, a precise location which all other measurements on the site would use as a reference point. As there was no such technology as GPS at this time, they used landmarks in the landscape to map this datum point. And for them, the handiest geographic landmark was the nearby CA&E Railroad Bridge, spanning the west branch of the DuPage River. From the center of the bridge, they measured the datum as being 201 feet south and 815 feet west, which today is about 20 yards north of the point where Indian Knoll Road bends westward, becoming Hawthorne Lane.
Again, using standard archaeological techniques, they then established a grid pattern of 5-foot by 5-foot squares, extending 85 feet north to south and 65 feet east to west, with most of the squares extending to the north and east of the datum point.
Over the course of the next 3 field seasons, from 1958 to 1960, Wenner and his crew worked several weekends per year, typically from late spring until early autumn, excavating 50 of the possible 221 grid squares in this large grid, to varying depths of 4 inches to 13 inches. They also dug a few nearby test pits in order to record the soil profiles near the excavation grid. They closed out the 1960 field season by digging an 18-inch deep trench along the 50 north east-west transect for a distance of 25 feet, in an attempt to assess the extent of the site and to obtain a profile of the ridge.
In addition to the work on their primary excavation grid, in August of 1959, Wenner's group also temporarily diverted their attention to another area on Kautz's farm, perhaps as a result of dissatisfaction with their finds to that point. Wenner referred to this new area as Unit 2, although it was only loosely described. Wenner's field notes were oftentimes incomplete, lacking in detail, or difficult to decipher, and so the exact location of Unit 2 is not known to archaeologists. However, it appears to have been on a lower terrace on the ridge slope, to the east of the spring, close to the river. Here, the small crew spent a few days excavating 3 or 4 squares, as well as a nearby test pit to ascertain the soil profile. Wenner noted that the dig here was rocky and that the finds were sparse.
Wenner's group did not return to the Kautz site in subsequent years, perhaps due to personal circumstances or schedules, as this was all being done on weekends and holidays. But it also may have been due to dramatic changes in the circumstances of the Kautz household, as Joseph Kautz passed away in November of 1961 at the age of 65. Just 1 month later, in December of 1961, Sanford H. Gates published a brief article in the Illinois Archaeological Survey Bulletin No. 3, entitled An Archaeological Survey of the DuPage River Drainage, in which he generally described the Kautz Site excavation, without specifically identifying it.
Gates's article provided a high-level summary of the Kautz Site findings shortly after the excavation had closed out, describing it as having 2 main occupations: the middle woodland, represented chiefly by Havana Hopewell pottery sherds, and the late woodland, as indicated by samples of Han cord impressed and Madison cord impressed sherds. Gates' article indicated that most of the materials were recovered from the excavated squares at a depth of 3 to 9 inches. He further stated that 18 projectile points were found scattered roughly evenly throughout the excavation squares, ranging in size from 22 millimeters to 50 millimeters, and most of crude workmanship. They also found scrapers, knives, and hammer stones in the assemblage. Curiously, Sanford Gates never mentions or credits Wenner or any of his other colleagues from the Kautz Site dig in this article, perhaps suggestive of a falling out.
Verna Benjamin Kautz passed away 10 years after the death of her husband Joseph. Not surprisingly, the Kautz Benjamin land was parceled up following her death. By the mid to late 1970s, multiple new homes were built within close proximity to the Kautz excavation site, almost certainly disturbing the area beyond recognition. In subsequent years, even more homes went in along Indian Knoll Road to the south and along Hawthorne Lane to the west, further and forever changing the historic and prehistoric landscape. In spite of these dramatic changes, the Benjamin Kautz barn still stands along Indian Knoll Road, just a few hundred yards south of the excavation area, painted a deep red.
Aside from Gates' brief 1961 article, no other subsequent articles documented the Kautz Site and its findings in more detail, an unfortunate and all too common occurrence in the earlier days of archaeology. The site would have languished in obscurity if its investigation had not been taken up by Peter J Geraci, who was then attending the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee in pursuit of a master's degree in anthropology, under the advisorship of noted archaeologist Robert J. Jeske.
As a result of his work, Geraci published an extensive description and analysis of the Kautz Site and its associated finds in 2016, as part of the completion of University of Wisconsin's master's degree program, entitled The Prehistoric Economics of the Kautz Site, a late archaic and woodland site in northeastern Illinois. In this paper, Geraci examined the material culture of the pre-contact peoples that once occupied the Kautz Site, as well as the original landscape they would have inhabited. He analyzed the subsistence strategies, resource exploitation patterns, and economic organization of these ancient communities, based on archaeological evidence found at the site. Further, Geraci set the context of the Kautz Site relative to other indigenous habitation sites sprinkled throughout the river valleys of northeastern Illinois. Finally, he investigated the lithics, or stone tools and debitage, found by Wenner's team, closely examining the likely origin and use of the raw materials for these tools, in order to better understand the resources available to the Kautz Site people.
Geraci's paper notes that the material evidence found at the Kautz Site indicated a long and consistent record of human habitation over the span of 5,000 years, extending from the late Archaic period to the late Woodland period, from roughly 4000 BCE to 1000 CE. The artifacts recovered included lithics in the form of chipped stone tools and debitage, almost 2,000 ceramic sherds, faunal materials such as bone, as well as a small assemblage of artifacts dated to the historic period. His analysis of the ceramics indicated that the majority belonged to the Middle Woodland, specifically of Naples stamped dentate, a variety of Havana Hopewell pottery. Some examples of late woodland pottery sherds were also found, although not nearly as numerous. The stone tools or lithics found at the site consisted of hafted and non-hafted bifacial tools, flake tools, multifaces, drills, and perforators. Kautz tools included samples from the late Archaic period, such as table rock, durst, and marum points. Examples from the early woodland in the form of contracting stemmed bifaces and motley cluster points. Pieces from the middle woodland, such as Snyder or Manker points. All of these types of projectile points, from the Archaic to the middle woodland, were likely used as spear or dart points, and probably thrown with a spear thrower or atlatl, a simple yet ingenious device that provides great mechanical advantage, which translated into superior dart speed and distance. Finally, the Kautz Site lithics also included specimens of the late woodland in the form of small arrowheads, such as raccoon-notched and Madison points, when bow and arrow technology came to the fore.
Why was the Kautz Site inhabited by so many groups of people over such a long period of time? Geraci notes that of more than 12,000 prehistoric archaeological sites that have been identified in northeastern Illinois, less than 1% of these provide evidence of more than a single occupation. A site with evidence of multiple habitations, such as the Kautz Site, is extremely rare and thereby very important. So what drew indigenous people to this location time and again over the millennia? To answer this question, Geraci provides a detailed analysis of the ecology, landscape, and resources that the Kautz location likely provided to its inhabitants for thousands of years.
Ecologically, the Kautz Site is located in what scientists refer to as Prairie Peninsula, consisting of a mosaic of grassland and prairies, which is interspersed with forest and wetlands, in the form of rivers, ponds, and marshes. Red oak, bur oak, and white oak trees predominate within the forest, with clusters of hickory trees, such as shagbark, also present. Such an environment is especially conducive to ecotones, the transitional spaces between different ecologies, fauna, and foliage, where key resources, such as wild game, edible and medicinal vegetation, are most accessible to humans. Indeed, Kautz Site inhabitants would have had access to resources including nut-bearing trees for food, and oak trees for tanning of hides, goosefoot, knotweed, maygrass, and cattails from marsh and meadow, and wild game, including white-tailed deer, various birds, turtles, beaver, woodchuck, badger, raccoon, fox, and muskrat, providing a broad-spectrum diet of both plant and animal species. Furthermore, the site was positioned below the highest part of the ridge, in the lee of the knoll, to the east of the bluff, providing protection from prevailing winds from the west. The higher elevation of the site also safeguarded the location from potential flooding from the nearby DuPage River.
But Geraci's analysis also demonstrated that one key resource was likely lacking at the Kautz Site. That was chert, a type of cryptocrystalline quartz typically found in limestone and dolomite outcroppings, and which was the predominant type of stone that local indigenous people used for making tools. The primary sources of chert in northeastern Illinois are known to have been Joliet Silurian chert, Platteville Galena chert, and Oneota or Starved Rock chert. Via a landscape analysis, Geraci was unable to conclusively identify any prehistoric quarry sites of these materials within 10 kilometers of the Kautz Site, a distance held by anthropologists to be a reasonable expenditure of time and energy for routine access to such materials. This means that Kautz Site inhabitants would either have to occasionally travel great distances to obtain this resource, or use trade networks to obtain this material, and at greater cost, meaning that the raw material would have been held dearly in the community, with coping strategies for restricted usage. Via observation and statistical analysis, Geraci found numerous examples of economizing of church material at the Kautz Site, such as the heavy reliance on bifacial tools, a high degree of reworking of tools, as well as the potential practice of hoarding.
But something else must have brought indigenous peoples time and again to this location, in spite of its limitations. And Geraci suggests an intriguing reason. He notes that what sets the site apart from most others in the region is the number of freshwater springs within close proximity of the site. In fact, there are multiple springs that seep out of the knoll overlooking the river, as well as larger springs to the south and east. Freshwater springs provide multiple advantages over river or pond water. They typically flow year-round and are less subject to freezing that might occur with a river, stream, or pond. And they tend to be free of contaminants, such as sediments, insect larvae, and animal detritus, more commonly known as poop. Springs, too, may have held significant spiritual significance to indigenous people, and were known in historic times to have been viewed as the source of life in the belief systems of some Native American tribes. Associated with the spiritual significance would have been the healing or medicinal properties associated with springs, which were sometimes cited as a remedy for rheumatism, fevers, bodily aches and pains, and eye maladies.
Yet another less tangible reason for the location's desirability suggested by Geraci is that the site was within fairly close proximity to the ancient east-west route linking the Fox River to the west near present-day St. Charles, with Lake Michigan via the Chicago River to the east. This route was recorded by multiple sources as being an old Native American trail, later co-opted by U.S. settlers, and would have passed about a half-mile to the north of the Kautz Site, along what is today North Avenue.
Finally, Geraci's paper links the Kautz Site to the broader context of habitation sites of indigenous peoples in northeastern Illinois. He notes that there are 24 sites in the region with overlapping cultural affiliations as the Kautz Site, but few with the same enduring time span of occupation. Most intriguing, Geraci links Kautz with the Winfield Mound Site, less than 2 miles downriver on the west branch of the DuPage, which also has both middle and late woodland components, including 3 surviving conical mounds of the effigy mound tradition, a possible mortuary ritual site. We've discussed the Winfield Mound Site in great detail in another video series on our channel.
The Kautz Site artifacts collected by Wenner and Gates decades ago are today kept safely in the permanent collections of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. The Kautz Site itself, as mentioned earlier in this video, is located on private property. As always, we would discourage anyone from trespassing on private property to gain access to sites such as these. It is, of course, both illegal and unethical to do so without the permission of the landowners. We ourselves were unable to gain permission to more closely examine the site. But in the end, we thought it too important to the history and prehistory of the region to keep it under wraps any longer. A place that has been occupied for more than 5,000 years by indigenous people needs to be recognized and celebrated as uniquely important.
The best way to see the Kautz Site today is from the vantage point of the Elgin branch of the Illinois Prairie Path, the former right-of-way of the Chicago, Aurora, and Elgin Railroad, which passes just a few hundred feet to the north of the site. Here you can best see what drew indigenous people to this location again and again: the leeward protection and shelter of an imposing ridge overlooking forest, fen, river, and meadow, and freshwater springs providing a consistent supply of clean water, as well as a source of spiritual strength. our observation point, the aged railroad bridge that once served to mark the location of the Kautz Site upon the ridge, connecting us to an ancient time and place, is now itself an artifact of the past, but yet serves as a bridge to understanding the deep history and prehistory of our shared landscape.
As always, if you enjoy these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share them. And if you're so inclined, consider supporting our channel via Patreon. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.